And we're really happy to have Dr. Felice Orlich here presenting on anxiety. Dr. Orlich is a pediatric neuropsychologist, and she's been practicing with children with autism for over 18 years. She's currently the outreach director at our Seattle Children's Autism Center with an emphasis on school-based interventions and training. And she does research which focuses on interventions with teens with autism and elementary age school-based interventions. So thanks, Felice.
Thanks, Jim. I'm assuming everyone can hear me because there is a microphone. So in the interest of not disclosing personal healthcare information, for those of you who know me, I have a little boy with autism. So this is relevant for me, and he's one of the kids who has anxiety. So you know my last name, so there's my PHI, but that's okay. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about just a quick reminder about autism and what it is very fast, because it's really relevant to interventions for kids with autism, especially with anxiety disorders. And I'm going to be using two words interchangeably. I'll use the word anxiety, and I'll use the word emotion regulation, because we see an anxiety disorder as a disorder of regulating your emotions. Okay, so a lot of the language will shift back and forth, but I wanted to give you guys a heads up because sometimes that's confusing for folks. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are supported by research and pretty much by the National Institute of Health as well as HRSA. Health Resources and Services Administration. So I just wanted to let you guys know I have to tell you that's behind some of this. Okay, so probably most of you or many of you know or have kids with autism. And it's pretty clear that now we have our new terminology as autism spectrum disorder. You probably know that there's a change as of May 18th in the terminology that we use. So we've put together the diagnoses of Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder and autistic disorder into one disorder now. And what that's really supposed to represent is that autism is a very, very broad spectrum. And if you know one child with autism, you don't know another child with autism. But what that comes down to is that the heterogeneity, all the variability we see in autism really needs to be taken into account when we make an intervention plan for kids. Okay? It's really important. And that's what I put here. Now, pretty much when we look at the autism spectrum disorders, there's a wide variability in onset, or at least noticing that there's a problem, we could say, in severity. Some kids, and I'm not sure how kids are represented here, have cognitive skills from well below average to well above average. Boys tend to be identified more than girls are, and I think I would like to use the word identified because autism spectrum disorders look different in girls and boys, and quite a few variety of skill domains can be affected. And we see that there's also a very high, what we call comorbidity or co-occurring rate of psychiatric and medical problems, in addition to neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'm going to be talking about the prevalence specific to anxiety. Autism can be detected by 12 months, but typically the average age of diagnosis is later. And now there's a very strong emphasis on the research side of the kind of spectrum to really start to focus on how early we can make detection and then how accessible we can make interventions for family, especially in families who are from a culturally not Caucasian, typical middle-class families. The age of diagnosis is typically closer to 9 years of age, which is quite late. And for kids who show more subtle features of autism spectrum disorders, sometimes we're not making the diagnosis until middle school or later elementary age. Now, our best practice approaches overall, and I'm kind of giving you the kind of big picture first, is that when we're trying to do interventions for kids with ASD, you can't just send them to a psychiatrist, for example, for medication management, and you can't send them to a psychologist for individual therapy. When we're addressing problems like anxiety for kids with ASD, we're really saying that it's a multi-system challenge. Okay, and it's a challenge where we need to see the strategies that we use become consistent. So I might develop a treatment plan in individual therapy with a child, but the parents have to carry out a lot of those strategies at home, and it's best if the school is involved as well, or that there's communication to the school about how those interventions should happen. Okay. Some of the medical needs, I just want to explain why it's so important to do this. So what we're seeing now is that, or what we're getting a better handle on, is that kids with autism also have a range of medical challenges that they face. We used to say that a lot of the medical problems that we saw in autism, not me, I don't want to put myself in the grand we, were really part and parcel of autism. But what we've come to understand more clearly is that kids with autism show a higher prevalence of specific medical concerns, sleep disorders being a primary concern for this population. And so we see some sleep disorders somewhere in a child's life with an ASD about 60% of the time, which is significantly higher than we see in other children. Sleep in particular, and this is why it's kind of a really take-home message, has a very strong relationship to anxiety. So the best way for you to think about that is if you're really tired, your threshold for tolerating stress is much lower. So if we see kids with autism who already are at greater risk for struggling with stressful situations, and they're also not sleeping well, we expect a higher degree of anxiety in this population. So it can become a chicken and an egg kind of fight for us. We're trying to improve the quality of their sleep, get them to sleep at night, get them to sleep through the night, for example, and then we have quite anxious youngsters when they're at school the next day. So sleep is actually one of the most common comorbid disorders with anxiety, and something that sometimes needs a different approach. In many of the kids, so we see about 50 to 60% of kids with autism spectrum disorders take some kind of psychotropic medication, and that can range from stimulant meds, like we see for kids who have also symptoms of ADHD, up through the atypical antipsychotics, and some kids also do take some mood stabilizers. Most kids have psychosocial and behavioral needs, and we also see there are things that need to happen educationally and in terms of ancillary services like speech and language NOT. Now, how does all of this fit together? I'm not used to using this clicker, and also I want to apologize for this slide. This slide was made when DSM-4 was still our manual, so I apologize. So there are 3 circles where there should be 2. So, but we don't need to go through the details of that, I hope. So some of the language challenges that we'll see in kids that can impact what, now I'm going to talk about emotion regulation. It's what you do in a stressful situation. Okay, you regulate, hopefully, your emotions. Some of you may not regulate your emotions really well at specific kind of meetings like IEPs and things, but I don't, and I really should, but not always. But for most kids with autism, we'll see that to some degree there's an impairment in communicative language. And for some kids are nonverbal, others have delayed speech, and kids who have more typical language development may show impaired conversational skills. Now these communication pieces fall together with the social. We've kind of put these 2 categories together now. But what these really talk about in all is what I would call overall social engagement. It's how well do you communicate and interact in your environment, and that is truly the core deficit in an autism spectrum disorder. But if you think about it, if you think about what anxiety is about and what emotion regulation is about, it's about having coping skills that can meet the demands of your environment. Because fear and stress actually have a protective factor for human beings. If a bear is running down the path, you want to feel fear so you get yourself out of there. So fear is actually it's something we need. We have it. It's not this random event that occurred to us. It's there because it needs to mobilize us to flee or it needs to mobilize us to freeze. Okay, so it's there for a reason. Now, when you have anxiety, it's when the stressors of the environment well exceed your coping. That's what it's about. It's your vulnerability to stress. And how we see kids with autism is as more vulnerable to stress. It's called the stress vulnerability hypothesis. Everyone has a tipping point for where they can't deal with their environment. So you all have buttons that can be pushed, right? So kids with autism essentially have more buttons that are pushed more frequently. That's a good way to think about what anxiety is. It's that tipping point. And that makes it different from depression, for example, because there's not as much of a tipping point there, but anxiety is really a tipping. It's like a seesaw. Okay. So in kids with autism, what we see is that these social communication impairments make their threshold for reacting, for not having good emotion regulation in a situation, lower. The other piece of the puzzle are what we used to call category 3 behaviors, but now it's the second category. And what we see there is that we'll see kids have really limited flexibility. So cognitive inflexibility is something we typically see in almost all kids on the spectrum. This is a big issue for them. Kids struggle with transitions as a result. And we also see now, fortunately in DSM-5, I'm happy to say, that sensory regulation problems are part of the diagnosis. We used to try to figure out where does it go, but it's a core part of the diagnosis now. And sensory challenges really are not friends to anxiety. Those two things, they really conflict with each other. So if you really can't manage loud environments and you go into a classroom every day, if you're thinking about that vulnerability hypothesis, your threshold for tolerating a minor change in the classroom is immediately lowered. Okay, and we're gonna call that an anxiety disorder, right? That's the label we put on that lowered stress threshold. Okay. All right, does that make sense to folks how it's all changing? Is this interesting? I hope so. All right, I don't want to bore you. So what we see from all of those things coming together is we'll see lower frustration tolerance. These are the words that parents use with us. Socially anxious. Sometimes we'll see a lot of somatic symptoms. So for example, poor sleep can both be a result or a cause of anxiety. We'll see some more stomach aches, headaches, backaches, a lot of aches and pains. So we'll see a lot of somatic symptoms. Sometimes those somatic symptoms are the first sign for us because kids with autism are not great at telling you how they feel, right? It's not a strength for them. Now, for the kids in general, the other thing that I like to think about, and I'll come back to this later, I have to make sure I watch the clock also, is that behavior generally serves a function, right? All of our behavior, good and bad, serves a function for us. And when we think about someone's emotional reaction, that reaction is also a signal. It's a signal that they're trying to get something done to manage their environment more effectively. And when you're anxious, your reaction is different than most other kids your age. And it's also often, for some kids with ASD, is interpreted as oppositional behavior. So how many of you have had that experience that a child's anxiety is described to be oppositional? All right. Do you want to know how many times I write in a report that it's not? About 99% of the time. So, because one of the diagnoses kids with autism come into our clinic with is oppositional defiant disorder. But really, if you have to look at the function of why that behavior is there to begin with. And generally, these are kind of the most typical hitters for that. Kids can't cope with the sensory demands of the environment, so they overreact. You know what that overreaction gives them? It gets them removed from that negative sensory environment. Really, is that oppositional or is that a coping strategy, right? Our definition of coping has to kind of be defined differently. And that gives them more control over their environment, right? So you act a certain way because that's a strategy that works for you to make the environment more workable. So if you're too stressed in a certain environment, you use the behavior that works. We all do, right? Like some people, I'm a New Yorker. New Yorkers kind of raise their voices to get what they want. Not me. I'm not one of those New Yorkers, but my brother is. And it can be really embarrassing in Seattle, where that really doesn't work, right? It works in New York, doesn't work in Seattle, okay? It's also an expression, of where, oopsie, help. I always goof this up. There we go. I did it. I fixed it. Okay. It can also be expressing overwhelm and change. So remember, kids with autism struggle with cognitive flexibility. A reaction, dysregulation, can just be because something changes. It's not the way, how many of you experience this? Your kids have an idea of how it should go, right? You make a minor change, and that change sets off this whole anxious reaction. It's not an oppositional reaction. It's a response to not feeling comfortable. And for, we've all experienced stress. I expect there's nobody in this room who has not experienced stress in their lives, right? So stress is usually about things not being as you expect them. But kids with autism are pretty black and white in their expectations. So when you change them, they'll experience anxiety. Because of the social demands, a lot of times it's in response to a misinterpreted social cue. So many of you have probably had the experience, I have had this for sure with my son, where what you're portraying in terms of your own emotional expression is not what they interpret, right? The interpretation is off. So where you just might be tired, they think you're angry, right? When you're just irritated at the traffic, they think you're yelling at them, right? A peer is busy doing their work and they think they don't like them, okay? There are lots of things that other people can tolerate as just the day-to-day changeability in someone's behavior. Maybe they'd be a little bit hurt, but it wouldn't become internalized and go to this big place where nobody likes me, sort of the exaggerated response. Okay. So the bottom line is what I would want to say is that emotional dysregulation that we often see is actually their coping strategy. The idea is to teach them different ones and for us to change the environment. So the common environmental precipitants, because there are clear precipitants that we can, I can ask these questions in a session and I really know we have a good thought. Group situations, changing the routine, when things are noisy or chaotic, like the last week of school. How many of the kids out there that you guys know had a rougher time the last couple of weeks? Okay. Did you feel like school should just be over and, yeah, those kind of things? Challenging academic tasks, trying to engage, but it's not really working out. And other people's rigidity. I think that because their behavior is considered to be oppositional, people become more rigid. It's my way or the highway, right? You're not doing what I want, and the press becomes to do it faster, or it becomes more strict or more structured, because that's a response that people might give to someone who really is just breaking the rules, right? And other people have a variety of reactions to the anxiety and the resulting kind of inflexibility that we see. Some people are irritable and impatient as a result, and that's because we're all human beings, right? Some people might feel victimized by the emotion dysregulation. They might feel enslaved to the kids' expectations and routines. Some people, this is confusing and saddening, not just for parents, but for the kids as well as their teachers and other folks. Some people think, the kids are just interesting and they just kind of say it's just who they are, right? And with peers, what's been really interesting for me to see is that the most dysregulated kids are not always the kids who aren't accepted. It depends on a variety of other factors, but we see like it's kind of a mixed peer response. And I've had a really good opportunity to see that in one of our research studies and have really been encouraged by that, actually. So here are the numbers. What we see in ASD is that the rates of anxiety are much higher than in other groups. So the range now, the new range that just came out, is that between 25% to 85% of people, individuals with autism spectrum disorder, will show symptoms of anxiety across somewhere in their lifetime. Okay. The challenge with anxiety is that this is a biological challenge for these kids. So it's not disappearing. It may change its face. It may be more mellow for a period of time, but it's going to be a recurrent pattern in their lives. It's just going to probably come up at different developmental periods. That doesn't mean to say that it's hopeless, like it's a terrible disabling condition, but it's important to recognize that it's going to be something that will persist. What we do see is that in kids in general, these are some other variety of statistics. Some say 44 to 55%, some say 11 to 84%. In general, we're landing at about 25 to 84%. Even 25% is more than the base rate that we expect for children in general, which is 1 to 7%. So kids with autism, even at the lowest estimate, are showing significantly more symptoms of anxiety than typically developing kids. The kind of anxiety that we see differs, though. So in kids with autism, we generally see anxiety that is very bounded or specific, and the specificity mostly comes around change and transition. That's the time that we see the highest degree of anxiety. That's the function that pops out for us all the time, as well as sensory issues. The other thing that we often see are specific phobias. So of the anxiety disorders that we see in kids with ASD, 60% of those disorders are specific phobias. But they're not kind of the specific phobias we might see in typically developing kids, which might be about spiders or stairs or elevators or weather. We do see weather quite a bit in ASD. Okay. I just had a little guy who I saw earlier today who kept repeating this social story while he looked out the window, which is, humans can't control the weather. Although in Seattle, you could feel like rain every day, so you feel like there's some control. But it was interesting because changes in weather make him so anxious that he has this social script that he goes through. Humans can't control the weather. I thought that was a really good one. And I said, yes, they can't, unfortunately. But the other thing that we'll see is that, like I was saying before, they're just not typical. But the phobias are specific. Many kids have specific phobias to sounds and specific sounds. So for my son, he's a very good musician. When people sing off key, I think I have that phobia too. But he really has it. So pitch and tone of people's voices, he's very sensitive to that. He fortunately doesn't scream about it anymore, but he did before. So that was a really strong reactivity, and it took us a long time to figure out that it was really my daughter singing that was setting him off. So stop that. No, I'm kidding around. That was a joke. She sings on key and pitch, which is good. Some of the risk factors that we've talked about that are specific to ASD. So like I talked about before, the way that we think about anxiety is a vulnerability by stress hypothesis. So we're always saying, how resilient is this person in a specific situation? So, and that's what we're always asking. So we're always looking for, what are the risks for ASD? So in other kids, risk factors for anxiety may include things like family stressors, for example. It may include their own physical limitations. But usually socially they're doing okay, except for kids with social anxiety, right? So what we'll see for this group of kids, it really focuses on social ability. So how socially able they are to be accepted by their peers and feel connected to a peer group has a very strong relationship to anxiety. We just finished up, I'm not going to talk about this research study in depth, but we just finished up a longitudinal study of teens with autism spectrum disorder, higher functioning teens, where we did a study where the kids either went into groups with other kids with high-functioning autism, or they went into groups with kids with typically developing kids. It was kind of half and half. And what we saw is that the kids who went into the typical peer group had better engagement between groups. So they would hang out at lunch with more kids. They would hang out with the typical peers. They were going to football games. They were doing those in-between school activities. And it was because the typical peers could make that effort. In our other groups in the schools, the kids who are only with other kids with ASD felt kind of marginalized, and they didn't make that connection. So really what that boiled down to was that the kids who were with typically developing peers felt more connected in their school environment. They felt like they belonged there. When we asked them afterwards, what is this about? And they said, oh, we belonged. We weren't the odd person out. They really felt like this sense of belonging. What we also saw among those two groups is that in the groups with typically developing kids, the kids had less anxiety and social stress. That's what they reported. And we saw that afterwards. So the kids may have come in with a high degree of social stress, but we saw a drop where they were typically developing peers. So that's really important, right? That says something about what we need to do to make the kids more resilient. Okay. Part of that, what we've started to really think about, is that anxiety disorders are also higher in kids with better language and cognitive abilities, and also in older kids. So for some kids, they don't show anxiety when they're younger, or they show little flares of it now and then. But as the kids go into 3rd grade and then up into 5th grade and hit adolescence, we see an increase in symptoms of anxiety. It's not typically an early onset problem. It's a later onset problem. And that could be because the kids become aware of their social environment. The light bulb goes on and they're not quite fitting in. Also, middle school demands, for example, are really different. The kids are moving rapidly between different environments. Kids move out of developmental preschool into a 1st grade classroom, which is much louder and more chaotic. Most developmental preschools shifts, not all. Okay? So what we do see is that kind of change. The other thing that we see is that kids with autism, as they get older, also, and this was from our study as well, we looked at about 300 kids with ASD from age 6 to about age 17. And what we saw is that as kids get older, they say that they feel more lonely, right? So that sense of loneliness or awareness of being lonely also increases, and that contributes to stress as well. It doesn't sound very good if you don't deal with it, right? That's really what it comes down to. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly because I'm going to kind of shift gears. But before I do that, I want to just stop and see if there are any questions. I kind of break it out like this. I give a little time to ask questions as I talk because I think that helps people out. So any questions at this point? If not, I'll keep talking. I could talk forever. So, okay. Yes?
What was the name of the study about the different groups that were of the typically developing and autistic group? What was the first one you mentioned? Is there a title of it or anything?
I'm trying to remember the title of our study. It's not published yet,
Okay.
So it should be out later, hopefully this summer, we hope. But if you're interested in learning more, you can email me.
Okay, thank you.
Because I can send you to the HRSA website.
Right.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
On a generalized basis, what's the effect of antidepressant drugs or anti-anxiety drugs?
That's a good question. So it varies for each child, but most kids who are not good responders to first behavioral therapies, because that's always the choice first, about 60% of those kids will be good responders to medication. But because there are other co-occurring pieces of the puzzle, it has to be really carefully done. So I think that's always the caveat. Like, we don't have a good sense of response rate to SSRIs, for example, the serotonin medications like Zoloft and Prozac, but they're pretty highly prescribed for this group. Okay, any other questions? Comments? David, you're here. You can answer the medication questions. I'm just a psychologist. I'm kidding around. Alrighty, so the basic rules of thumb, just when we're using interventions for kids with ASD, is that saying no doesn't work. No, doesn't work. Don't be so anxious, that's not gonna work. What's better is to give explicit instruction to tell the kids what you want them to do with incentives. Remember that behavior serves a function. I think I've nailed that home. And if you're going to use humor, like most typical kids can be humored out of anxiety, right? Kids on the spectrum can't be humored out of anxiety. So you have to be really careful. Some can, some can't. But where you might use humor, don't think they're going to get it, because they're not good at getting jokes, right? The other rules of thumb are to make sure that you have a plan. You know, anxiety in most kids needs a stress plan. In this group of kids, you need a really clear plan. So that's going to be important. And you're going to think about how to make predictability and routine. You don't want to go overboard with this. This is really important, because if you become too routine, flexibility is going to be tough on the other side for you. But you want to think about doing that. You want to be concrete with your information. It's not that helpful to say, how are you feeling? For example, that's a really open-ended question. For a young person with autism, you'd want to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you've taught them about a scale, uncomfortable, comfortable. Or you could just say, are you comfortable or are you uncomfortable? Even using the word anxiety is kind of abstract. Okay, you want to make sure to provide visuals when you need to, or some organizational supports. And I know I put this one last, but I probably should put it at the front of these slides. And that's about decreasing sensory overload. So one thing to think about is if you're going someplace where you expect it to be chaotic, we're hitting summertime, which means July 4th, which means family picnics. It's okay to let the kids do their own thing. You know, they need a space to retreat when there's a lot of sensory input. No matter what your family say. Okay? It's really the bottom line. No matter what grandma and grandpa say. Yep.
Are you going to explain what a stress plan is?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, I'm just giving you all the... I think it's helpful if you know the why. It'll be easier for you to take the strategies and use them, because anxiety it's not like rocket science, you know. The medication management part of it is, you know, but I think on the behavioral side, it's a little bit clearer what to do. Although it's not easy, right, to do, the strategies are accessible to understand. There's this also, there's a really good app that just came out for the iPhone called Take a Chill. Okay, it's a really cool app. Some of the kids who work with me use it. And the app actually has these kind of stress plans on it and steps to doing self-calming. And it kind of cues the kids to do it. It's really pretty cool. So you guys should look at that for it's already laid out. And it's good for the iPhone, and now they made it for Android. So, Take a Chill. I was trying to get it on my cell phone while I was up here, but... It does, and it's nice on the iPad because it's big. So the folks at UCSD, University, I went to UCSD as a graduate student, and at UCSD and UCLA, they have a very strong focus on mindfulness-based stress reduction strategies. And in the study that we just wrapped up, that was an integral part of our social skills programming. So we've had some feedback that maybe we got the outcomes that we did because we put in this stress reduction component. It's part of it. And there's some really cool and easy strategies to use there. And from my experience, they work really well, better than the kind of more cognitive strategies. And I'll talk about why in a little bit. So emotion regulation, or the ability to cope with stress, involves the ability to recognize that you're upset and to cope with that. For example, through knowing what emotion you're feeling, understanding why, knowing how to calm down or emotion regulation. And also the most important thing for kids on the spectrum is to be able to identify situational challenges, okay? So a simple example is you're going to the dentist. I'm like terrified of the dentist. Seriously, I have like a phobia of the dentist. It's really like awful. So when I go to the dentist, I know that in order not to run out of that office when I hear a drill, I have to have all of these things to keep me calm, which includes noise-canceling headphones, right? I'm serious. I'm really afraid of the drill. So it has some experience to it. So bad dentist experience when I was in 3rd grade. So I know I can identify that situation for myself. It's a really clear one, the dentist, but everyone has those kind of situations. Some people don't like to wait. It makes them anxious. So you have things prepared. You have your own little toolkit that travels with you and you can identify situational stress. That is probably the easiest thing for kids with autism to learn to identify. It's much harder for them to do emotion identification. So a lot of our interventions really rely on this. If they're done well, these are kind of the modifications that we make. Now, emotion regulation is important because you won't get too far in life if you scream at people, right? And you won't get very far in life if you run out of the room very often. You certainly won't keep your job as an adult. So when we're thinking about emotion regulation, it's really core for kids with autism because we want them to eventually enter the workplace, right? And we want them to be able to maintain long-term relationships. And one of the things that we're seeing is the trend as kids leave the special education system at 21 is it's hard for them to maintain the gains they've made. And part of that is probably about emotion regulation, right? That they have a hard time leaving the house, for example. We see a lot of young adults who just don't want to get out of the house, right? So, and if we don't teach them coping strategies when they're younger, it's going to be much harder for us to teach a 21-year-old. Because then mom and dad can't really get them out of the house, right? So we're really very, very important. It also gives a person a better sense of self-efficacy. If you know that you have a toolkit for certain situations, then you are much better at saying, okay, this is going to be really tough. I'm scared about it, but I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm.
So to your response to this, would you be able to like name the time or the period where you like kind of developed a toolkit and then some of those in the computer, like just some examples?
Sure. You guys want some examples of toolkits? I'm going to come to that. So it's okay. Don't worry. You should ask me the questions as we go along. But just to give some examples of toolkits, those are good. For kids who really respond well to sensory things, you can have in that toolkit things that they like to hold on to, for example, or manipulate with their hands. That would be a good example of something that goes into a toolkit. If you think your kids are starting to breathe quickly, another good thing in a toolkit is a pinwheel, because you have to breathe on that a certain speed to make it spin, or bubbles. These are really simple ideas, but you have this toolkit of fun things to do. For other kids, it could be an iPad, to be really frank, because they can actually play on the iPad during a stressful situation. It can be music. It can be headphones if it's about loud noises, right? It's all about giving them those things that you know calm them. That's what goes into that toolkit. For some kids, it's going to be a social story or a script for how do I calm down in specific situations. It really varies. Yeah.
When you're talking about how like a lot of adolescents that are into like they have difficulty in transitions because they feel what are some like
For adolescents,
yeah, like you're trying to go from putting type and like what are some mobile tools and features that can help them make them feel more comfortable and at ease?
So the question is how to help young or older adolescents and young adults who are making a transition, what are some tools to help them that are mobile? That's a good question. So the one beauty of technology is that there's a lot we can build out for someone in an app, just in terms of having a schedule or expectation, even as simple as the notes function on an iPhone, for example. You could have a schedule of what to expect and what to do that someone can access, like their own dictionary. We used to have kids have those things on cards that were laminated, but now we can put it on a phone, and it's very cool. Or if you use an app like the Take a Chill app, we can tell them, before you go into this social situation, scroll through this and do some of the relaxation strategies. Does that make sense? So technology really has this nice boon to it. The other piece of it that I think is really powerful is to really recruit peers or other adolescents and young adults to help with that bridge. So they don't have to walk into a room alone, for example, and don't have to negotiate a college campus. So I think that peer piece is really critical. Okay, so I think I've talked about this, why it's hard. Why is it hard to do emotion regulation? The first is that feelings aren't logical or concrete, right? They're really, really unpredictable. The way I react, me as a person, react to a situation today could be really different tomorrow. Like today, I might be really friendly, not in a rush, for example. Tomorrow, I could have something due right as you cross my path, and I barely say hello. So my affect, my emotion, really changes day to day, right? Most typical people kind of just take that in. They know that emotion is unpredictable, not logical. My son said this really great thing. He was trying to figure out why my daughter wasn't friends with someone for a while, but now they're friends again. It just did not make sense to him. And he said, I think my logical mind just can't process that. I'm like, I live with Dr. Spock. But the reality, that fortunately did not come out of my mouth. All right, but the reality is that the way in which the information is processed, it's not linear. Emotions aren't like, if you do this, then this will occur. It's more like, if I smile at someone, they might smile back at me, or they might not. If they smile, they might like me. They still might like me if they don't smile back. It's very unpredictable. Okay? And emotion regulation also, it means you have to be able to self-monitor. You have to know how you feel, right? And that's a core challenge for kids with autism. And then there's the social interaction piece. It's also difficult because emotions themselves can be very overstimulating. Oh, yes?
I have a 27-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
and in the past 5 years, her ability to know her emotions, express her emotions, and say it very well, have become part of her life.
Yes.
So a lot happens after these years of your study.
I know. A lot happens in young adulthood.
Yes, and so that's very reassuring. To all
It
of
is.
us.
It is. It is. But there must be things that you did that are really
Well,
positive.
She had a fabulous therapist.
Yeah.
Who was incredibly patient. They worked through art a lot, as
Mhm.
well as talk,
Mhm.
and really didn't pressure. Let the wounds heal for a long time before they ever talked about anything. It was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Then, I don't know, we all keep trying,
Yeah, but I think the core is that intervention works.
Yes,
That's really what you're saying, is that there's maturation, but there's also intervention that really works. So, I have had, this has been my month of success, that I'm feeling as, for the kids that I've seen over time. There's a young man that I saw who, when I met him when he was 9 years of age, he couldn't be in a mainstream setting. He was totally on sensory overload. Couldn't do it, was kicked out. He'd been put in a behavior program. His parents pulled him out, homeschooled him, which was a good choice for him. And he just graduated from college. The highest honors, he's got a job. He has a girlfriend. I think that's a success. And at one of the high schools that we consult to, we have this joke because we said, what are our interventions to get kids to prom? right? And so they sent me a picture of a limousine full of boys who are really cleaned up. And the girls, too, I'm like, who are those kids? Going to prom. And I'm like, okay, so it can happen, but there's a lot of intervention that went into all of those kids, you know, and it was successful. So it's figuring out what it is, but it's also knowing that you have to deal with it. It's like not just accommodating the kids' anxiety and making all of these environmental modifications, but it's also teaching them how to cope. Yeah.
The problem is that because I've seen this progress in the last 5 years and I go to 27, there's so little help out there for how to continue the progress.
There is very little help.
It's a very big concern.
Yeah, there is.
It doesn't just stop, I'm convinced, because it didn't just stop in the past 5 years when she was in school.
No, but she's learned something. But I think, though, that is a fear that many parents have, and I think that's a concern that we have in the community at large, that we had a very strong focus on early diagnosis and intervention, and then now here we are, all of the kids have grown up. That's why I work with teens and young adults, because I think that's where the help needs to happen now. And then the kids grew up, and not everyone kept pace with what do we need to do for that population of kids. So we're just starting to get it. You know, that's why we have this drop-off now in employment for this population of kids, and that's really a worry. We put all of this time and effort in, but we didn't do what we need to do that's necessary to help them make a successful transition. So I agree with you, but it is high on the agenda. I would say it's one of the highest agendas now, especially in the research community. So, and in the social system, because it's extremely expensive to have that happen. Okay, so this pretty much is kind of sums up how this idea of stress and vulnerability that I've been talking about is that kids with ASD have problems on a daily basis because their coping skills or their resilience, for most, those who've had intervention do better, overwhelm what they're faced with. So it's kind of like every day they have to deal with some type of almost like near panic situation for a lot of the kids. I think it's good for you to think about that. But what we do see, this is the good news, is that coping strategies really reduce stress and what we call arousal. So arousal is this word that just means you're too alert, right, to the situation. It means you're hypervigilant, you respond too fast. So the best example of arousal that I can give you is someone makes a noise like that, and then, what's that? Right, that's hyperarousal. That means that my response to the situation is way over the top. It's too loud for, right? It's like, I think that's the best way to describe it. And the good thing is that stress reduction, which is different than anxiety, cognitive behavioral interventions per se, because I'm going to talk about both, really can positively affect the symptoms and just the ability to cope. So the targets for intervention that we think about with anxiety will be emotion recognition, but with a stronger focus on behavior regulation. And like I said before, the important piece is going to be identifying what is activating that arousal button. So what's pushing you to think that everything is a bear? That's really the way for you to think about it. Like, there's a little, kitty cat, but your child thinks it's a bear, right? Or you're just a little bit disappointed and they think it's the end of the world, right? That means your arousal state is too high, okay? The other piece of it, and these are the things we try to get to, are identifying your own and others' emotional states so you can read the environment better, and regulating your own emotions during stressful situations. So the idea is that we focus on what's activating, and then we teach you how to regulate your own emotions. And sometimes, in the meanwhile, we skip identifying your feelings. So in a typical cognitive behavioral kind of therapy paradigm, something happens like a child doesn't get invited to a party is a good example. And a child's thoughts about not being invited to the party. I'm so stupid, no one likes me, I'm ugly. All of those I'm, like kind of universal modifiers, are kind of distorted thinking. And then the child feels depressed or anxious next time a social situation comes up. That's what happens when typical kids have problems with anxiety. It's kind of this very cognitive triad, and we say the way you think about the world is the way you feel. Okay, so with a lot of typical kids who have language, we work on those thoughts. We try to correct those thoughts. And for kids, so let's say a kid who's not experiencing anxiety, they might not get invited to a party, and they'll be like, well, we really weren't great friends anyway. Does that make this really different way of thinking about life? So they just kind of move on. Maybe they're a little bit disappointed, but they move on, right? But kids on the spectrum don't move on, right? But even if we know what those negative cognitions are, I can guarantee that if you don't work on the activation component first, you're going to be arguing a lot, okay? Because it's very hard to beat cognitions in a kiddo with autism, right? This is a really tough approach, at least when you start. The other things that we think about before we go to that challenging of cognitions is to really focus on communication skills. So remember, I said that the social piece of it makes anxiety a lot worse. So we're not only working on regulating your emotions, we're also working on improving your social skills. And we're also increasing just positive interactions with peers. Now, you can kind of tell where my research comes from, because I'm aiming for emotion regulation, but I do it in this context, because I don't think they can be split apart for kids with ASD. So when we're talking about the arousal part, and this is kind of a little technical, so bear with me while I walk through this. I tried to make it really concrete, okay? So the activating event, the situation, the stressful situation, some people call it the inset situation, there's a variety of words for it, is asking someone to play. The physiological arousal for kids who show more problems with regulation is feeling nervous or anxious. What that might look like in a child with autism is avoidance, right? It could also be pushing another peer, right? It could be a variety of different behaviors. And the overt behavior, what you see because their arousal is too high, is no when they run away. You might see avoidant behavior. You can also see hitting. You can also see taking. You can also see barging in with what you want to do, because it's very controlling. Okay? So then what you're doing here, right, is that overt behavior of no means that you're worried. So there are some things where we try to label their internal state, but that usually comes later. So what you're going to try to do is you're going to try to do what's called counter conditioning. That's the kind of technical word for it, because to start with, what's happened over time for most kids with ASD, because they're not successful socially, is asking someone to play has become related to anxiety, right? It's become a dangerous situation for them because they've not been successful. Does that make sense? So those two things are coupled together. So they run away. That's a great flight response, right? That's what should happen. This is a bear to them, okay? That's how I think about it. So we have to make this less of a bear. And we can't do this by arguing with them, right? We can't initially do this by saying, it's not really a bear. You know, those look like nice kids. See, they're smiling and playing, because all the kids are seeing is bear. They're loud and they're playing on the playground. So what we try to do is we're going to try to attack the physiological arousal by teaching the kids relaxation strategies. That's why I was saying bubbles, okay? Because the strategies are really not that sophisticated, actually. So what we would do is we would practice, and we do this in a really methodological way, where we start out from really flat scenes. So, for example, pictures of kids playing. And at the same time, we give them different relaxation strategies, or we build that toolkit for relaxation. And we practice. So for those people who are here from the Autism Center, you'll see us walking around with the kids sometimes to say hello to people. We'll knock on your door. They'll have to say hello. So they'll start out by talking with adults. We might go into the waiting room. We ask parents to practice. Often we have them in groups for the older kids. And the goal is really we're trying to decrease this arousal state. And then what we see over time, with help, because at the same time we're building their social communication repertoire, we'll see they'll go invite someone to play. And I would tell you that initially that's a plant when we're first trying it out. Right? We don't just say, you know, wow, your anxiety is great, go on the playground. We usually have a willing playground playee. Does that make sense? Okay. So the goal of stress management is for us to identify the stressors. Okay, for us, for most kids to start off, we're saying what they are, okay? And then we're going to help figure out what relaxation strategies they can use so we can decouple that bear, because it's really their arousal, their response to the situation that's making the cycle stick to where it is. For older kids, we sometimes use a stress hierarchy. I just did this today with an entire family. It was so much fun. I had the whole family do a stress hierarchy so their son could see that stress happens to everybody. It was really, really a nice intervention. So a stress hierarchy usually are a bunch of different things that are occurring through the day, and we ask the kids to number what's least stressful, right? Cleaning the bedroom is not least stressful for some kids, to the most stressful. So I think looking at this, probably many of you would say this is a very stressful event, having to get off the computer when told, having to stop watching TV, maybe taking a shower. For more sensory kids, it really varies. It's not going to be the same for each child. For some kids, we make the hierarchy this way. And this is how we're looking for our activating events, just so you know, that's what we're going for. I actually now flip this the other way. You know, I make my triangle the other way, and I put a thermometer here because it's easy for a lot of kids to understand that. So it's up to you how you use it, but this is how I tend to flip it at this point. So at the tip here, you know, there wouldn't be very much stress. And then there's moderate stress, and then there are very stressful events. So what we would do in therapy is we tend to expose the kids or put them in the situation of moderate stress. We never start out in the very stressful place because they will never come back to our offices. So it will not happen. Their parents won't come back. We won't come back. It's just not a good idea. And for some kids, we'll pick just a little stressful event because we know they really can't go here yet. And if we feel that we're really starting down here, these are the kids that will really be thinking about referring for a med consult right off the bat, because we should be able to be doing this a little bit, right? Kids should be able to tolerate some degree of stress if we think we're going to be successful. Does that make sense? So our thresholds are right at about there. At least my threshold is. There's no science to it, but that's where the threshold typically is for most psychologists. So then the next step of the process is we teach the kids some relaxation strategies. We give them some social scripts for how to deal with whatever the specific situation is, right? And then, like for the little guy I saw today, he's learned to say, weather is not under human control, right? Because it's not under my control. Here's what I'm going to do to pay attention to something else, because distraction works for him, right? That technique of distraction, he's got a lot of different interests. So distraction works and he can move on, okay? And get out the door and go in the rain today. So I thought that was a successful day. So his stress about that is moderate, but he has a really clear toolkit for what to do in those situations. And we supported him through initially, like almost really supported him through physically, okay? but we don't use physical or any of that stuff at Children's, just so we're really clear. And and now that he's been successful, let's say with the weather, now we'll move on to other stressors, right? Which might be homework, for example. So we assume there's this toolkit, he's been successful, we move on to homework, or we move on to transitions. And we keep moving up or down the hierarchy, depending on how you flip this graph, until we move to things that are very stressful. Yeah? That is a good question. How do you know where to put things on the stressor? That's where it's really subjective.
Like if I were to like observe person's like behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, I could say, you know, for them like that's very dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion. It's not their action.
Right. So the question is, what overt behaviors would you be looking for if someone can't tell you where the situation falls? So you'd be looking at the person's behavior most days, right? And you would look at what does calm behavior look like for them, and what does the most dysregulated behavior look like for them, and that's where you would make your judgment. So a good example is for a child who runs away, that would go into this very stressful. Turning away, like just facing away, for example, and not talking, that would go into the moderate stress category for a child who runs away. For a child who stops talking but doesn't run away, that would be their very stressful. Okay? So it all changes depending on what your overt behavior is. Does that make sense to folks? Right? Like for my son, what he does is he starts to talk too much. Like he won't be quiet. He just talks constantly when he's really anxious, and he'll keep massaging it until we could all jump out of the car sometimes, you know. But really, like, he worries about getting sick, for example. He can really get over-focused on that, and I know that's a very stressful event for him because he talks too much. When he was little, he bit. Go figure. So his stress hierarchy has changed. Was there another question? Yes?
So a combination of behaviors, like maybe withdrawal from talking,
Mm-hmm.
staying in a mildly social situation, and then progressing to isolating yourself in a room,
Yeah,
would be a combination, and they kind of all pile together.
they do. It's cumulative.
Right. So the
So-
early lack of communication is indicating where things are going if it becomes.
I know what you're talking about. Yes, so yes, as the stress increases, you'll see more withdrawn behavior typically. So what will happen is you'll see more withdrawal, the higher the stressor, or more acting out. I hate to use the word acting out because what I'm talking about is aggression. So you might go from talking loudly to yelling to throwing or hitting. Or if it's isolation, it would be quiet, kind of reticent, to not really responding, to staying in your room and not coming out. Does that make sense? That's a good way for you guys to think about your child's stress level. Wow. Am I going too slow? Jim's like, it's okay, Felice, keep talking. Okay. So some of the ways to reduce stress is to think in advance, right? And it's also to really increase a person's sense of control. And one of the ways to do that is to think about providing opportunities to exert control over the environment. And that's what goes into your toolkit. Like, you're feeling really stressed out, you have a choice. Do you want me to back off for a while and we'll talk again in 15 minutes? Right? What are your choices? And you give really concrete choices of how to manage stress. You provide predictability where you can, or conversely, you teach the kids to provide their own predictability. That's the long-term goal as an adult, is how do you make the environment more predictable? What do you take to the dentist? Would be a question in my household. You provide enjoyable self-esteem building activities. Not everything is about therapy, right? Not everything is about a therapeutic social skills group, a therapeutic anxiety group. It's just about having fun and enjoying yourself. That's a really important thing. I think we don't focus enough just on our kids' wellness, just about the joy of life. That's really important. You want to think about reducing known stressors. So if you know, you'll figure out what stresses your kids out on this hierarchy. You're going to want to think about proactively, how do you reduce those? Okay? You want to make sure your kids get exercise. The one challenge that we see, especially with young boys, hitting middle school with autism, is that they become less and less active. The more sedentary you are, the less endorphins you have running around in your body. So exercise of some kind is really important. And we also want to think about not just using calming strategies proactively. We want to be, retrospectively rather, you want to be proactive. So it might be funny to people who walk by my office that I make these guys do some meditation exercises. Like, they joke around with me, like, what are you making me do? Do I get down in lotus position? But it's not about that. It's really practicing and using different calming strategies. They can be sensory. They can go to doing some breathing exercises or what we call meditation. There's a variety of different strategies you can think about. For some kids, it's a walk around the building holding something heavy. You really have to think about what are those breaks from the sensory overload of the day. Now, the idea with anxiety is not to let it go to the place of no return. Because once you're at a point of panic, once you're, over here, once you're there isn't really return until it's over. Have any of you experienced that with your kids or with yourselves, that if you are in a place of panic, you have to just ride it out? It's not something you'll stop. It's something that you clear the decks, you back off, you let it run its course. Because if you interfere, it'll make it worse and it will actually reinforce the behavior. It just perpetuates the cycle. So you don't want to get there. You want to be as proactive as possible. And that's where a stress plan comes into place. You want to think about, what can the quiet space be? So the best example that I can give you is you're going to a family gathering, a big family gathering, where everyone wants to talk to your child who doesn't really want to talk back at the moment because it's too loud, too many people are hugging them and touching them, and oh my goodness, and my culture is really loud, so my son is like, I am so out of here, and it took a long time for my family to just live with that, and they do now, and so he always has a defined quiet space that he can go to wherever we're going. Does that make sense? It's like you've got to say in advance, change your expectations, and even if your family's giving you a hard time about it, know what's best for everybody. Okay, there's no shame in it. I mean, it might feel that way, but there isn't. You have to think about what the sensory environment might be like in advance, and you have to teach them to judge sensory environments. This is about where the kids learn, what is my activating situation as well. You want to think about providing that toolkit or calming activities, and also using the relaxation strategies the kids know. Okay. There's some really good resources out there. There's a really good book called Helping Your Anxious Child. It has a really ton of good activities. Some of the activities also for sensory challenges are really good. You could just go that route and you'd be in good shape. Now, the next step is really, once the kids know this is an activating situation for me, you really teach them about coping strategies or relaxation and calming strategies. So these are some of them. Some are active, some are more passive. There's using breath control. Sometimes I make everyone do a relaxation while we're here, but at night you start to fall asleep, so I'm not going to do that. But if the kids fall asleep, that's okay. Do you know what I mean? If they're that stressed out that they need to snooze for a little bit, let them. It's fine. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I apologize. A couple
Sure.
pages back. When they're in the time where they're asking another child to play, or you're asking them to do that,
aside and you have them do a breathing technique or whatever, are you asking them to do that same thing right after that, or are you just saying, okay, we're going to exit in the situation?
It
Like
de-
if you get your child to kind of calm down or whatever.
Yeah, and then so they calm down and they go ask someone to
Like,
play.
how do you want to go ask?
I would just say, I wouldn't even say now. I would say, let's do 3 deep breaths and then go and ask. That's something really important to know with this population of kids. Don't ask, now are you ready? Because they'll tell you no. That just starts the whole cycle again. So you have to move right from being less aroused into the situation. Okay, but afterwards you could say, great job, how about 3 deep breaths? Because they may be like, so if you feel like their anxiety is going back up, you bring the calming strategy back in because you don't want to make the anxiety on the other side stick as well. Yeah, but just move right through it. That's where you rush your kids. Not rush, but you just say, let's go. You just get really directive and say, first this, then that. Okay. All right. Any other questions about that? Some kids won't take that direction. I know some of the kids, and they won't do that. But most can learn to do this. So it's really helpful to do, to teach your kids breath control. The app that I told you about is a really good one. There's also a really good website from UCLA that has 10 short mindfulness exercises that are really accessible to kids. One really strong one, and now people are starting to look at what are the different kinds of methods that can work, is there was a group at, I'm not sure where they were. I want to say they were in North Carolina, where they taught kids who were really reactive, anxious, reacted out of anxiety, how to do this thing called pay attention to the soles of your feet. I know it sounds really weird. We do weird things as psychologists, but it's effective. Because the idea is that you pay attention, not necessarily to the soles of your feet, because maybe you have really sensitive feet. I'm not sure. But when you're feeling really stressed out, you pay attention to a part of your body that feels relaxed. Does that make sense? And so that response of being hyper aroused has to compete with the relaxation feeling. It's a very strong intervention. And so on the UCLA MARC, you can get it through the iTunes U, but you can just Google UCLA and MARC. On that is that relaxation. It's about 5 minutes long. And what you do is you keep moving back. We call it taking a sidelong glance, okay, where you're anxious about something, right, but you get yourself calm, you focus on something in your body that feels good. A lot of times it's hands, for example, because kids with autism do a lot with their hands to fidget and self-calm. And then they kind of look from the side at the thing that makes them feel nervous. Right, you kind of are doing something that's calming, you pay attention to that, it keeps your feet on the floor effectively, and you look at it from the side. Okay, does that make sense? It's a very strong method.
You're looking at what's making you anxious from the side?
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, you kind of look at it, and eventually you want to be able to say, there it is, right? But initially you don't. It's how we do systematic kind of desensitization. Okay. I'm going to jump ahead so I have more time for questions. Yeah.
I don't know if it's not a specific question, because what I run into with my child is everything seems to work for maybe a day, and then it extinguishes itself very quickly in our the visual strategies, and just take a breathe, big breath, and then she's like, not breathe, not breathe, not breathe. And her first then the iPad, not iPad, not iPad, whatever it is, distraction will work maybe for a little while, and then it just extinguishes itself very quickly.
So you need something novel all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. So what that usually means is that she's not really relaxing. So, whatever the strategy isn't quite making it. It's like working a little bit, but then she's still aroused. So it probably means that the calming strategy has to go for longer, and you have to use a reward with it. So it's not intrinsically motivating to stay in an anxiety-provoking situation, right, for any person.
It's interesting that she'll stand in front of a mirror and work herself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it kind of perpetuates itself. So, and it's reinforcing. That's the hard thing. It's like, do you know how some kids have like that mastery thing? It's really scary and you try to master it. Kids with autism take it to another degree where it kind of gets into that perseverative loop. That's part of perseveration. So it's almost when you see her, when you just see her starting that, you would offer an alternative, but you're going to have to reward that really heavily for her. You're going to have to put a big incentive on that.
And that's what we tried with the iPad, so that's like, if we're in the, that's the most important
Yeah.
thing for the world, and stuff, and she even gets to where she's like,
I would-
"Not iPad, not iPad."
I would make it,
Candy and we do,
yeah, I would go back. I think you're too far along the path. You know, on that stress hierarchy, I think it's too far. You're hitting it when the stress is already moderate. So for her, I would go backwards and go to the really low stress situation and reinforce her there, and then I would work it up.
This is becoming like getting out of the car,
Huh.
leaving the house, going to bed,
Wow.
taking a shower, everything is just becoming
Everything is becoming difficult.
very high stress, and she is on it.
Yeah.
Sometimes a little.
Yeah. Who is she in therapy too?
No, not really. We've got a home program and a school program.
Okay.
She's seen a psychiatrist.
Okay. That might be worthwhile. You know, just looking at it, because sometimes it's just a different philosophy.
Yeah, lots of different FBAs going on and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Everybody's figure out the purpose of what
The function?
behavior create, what is she getting from this behavior we
Hmm.
can
Okay. It sounds like it's a puzzle. So I don't have a quick answer for you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Things extinguish themselves quickly.
Yes, yes, and that you have to keep moving different motivators out, and you just recycle them. So your toolkit's just really big. So you might say, pick one. Do you know, rather than saying, here's the one, pick one, and that might distract her enough.
She gets to, well, even choices. Do you want?
She doesn't want to make that either.
Don't make choices. You
Okay.
can't choose, can't choose, can't choose. I mean, you
Hmm.
can give her broccoli or a jelly bean, and she'll be like, I can't choose, can't choose. And she gets into a full-on panic.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
So, and that's another one that's real hard, is trying to give her, I mean, it's just we're all.
Choice
so
isn't
automatically
working either.
give her
Yeah.
control, and as soon as you say choice, she just triggers into panic mode.
Okay. Yeah, it would be good to consult on that one, just so I would have more time.
It sounds like what we're talking about is almost like yoga training, or the mindfulness.
Mhm.
Has there ever been any studies done as far as the effectiveness of mind-body
Kind of
control?
therapies. Well, I would say that now, and that's really good. I just gave a research talk on that about 8 months ago. And so there's a good, solid, emerging body of literature coming out that it might be the way to go, actually, that I wouldn't call it yoga necessarily, but because that's a movement kind of therapy, but that using more of the strategies that target arousal are better, and the mindfulness strategies specifically target that, right? And so now that's really an emerging part of kind of looking at kids with autism, but it works for other kids. That's a good piece. So we'll see. It's an open question. So I went through that. So the other part is, and this is sort of to help you guys make some decisions, like the buzzword for anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy. And at this point, most of us flip these things around where we do behavioral cognitive therapy because we have this strong focus on what is the situation versus trying to convince someone, like probably like your daughter, that their thoughts are not quite right, right? Like, so more of our approach is to start off with those reducing arousal, and then we'll move to the cognitive behavioral therapies. There is some emerging literature that when we use that approach, where we go for arousal and then to CBT, is that it is effective in reducing anxiety, especially with higher functioning kids. So that's really a strategy meant for kids who have good access to language. Okay. But there are some gaps in the research. There aren't many validated studies. And the manuals we have, sort of the approaches we have, are mostly designed for things with typically developing kids. But again, that's really coming out this year, which is great. So I would this just kind of explains what the model looks like. So rather than focusing on arousal, right, in that situation, we focus on thoughts. So this is where you engage a kid around their thinking, and we teach them a new adaptive thought, and then we'll see increased initiation. Do you see how the two models are different? One doesn't focus on how you think about it, and the other does. That's the difference between kind of the cognitive behavioral therapies or stress management. That's where the two fields diverge. But usually you'll move from the first, the arousal kind of approach, to working on cognitions. So my parting words, so you guys can ask me more questions, are to think about teachable moments all the time, to be proactive, and to use reward. Because like I said, anxiety is a self-perpetuating piece of the puzzle, so you need to have some heavy guns to get the kids off of that cycle, especially when they have autism. Alrighty, I'm open for questions. Go ahead. Yes?
When you were talking about the sleep, I was just wondering what are some different tools so that they get more sleep? I mean, just.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good question. So there has been quite a bit of research looking at the use of melatonin in kids with autism. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but there is some good research to suggest that it's helpful for this population of kids, and that kids with autism spectrum disorders do not have the same level of melatonin in their system as other kids do. So that would be a first pass for sleep onset. That doesn't keep your child asleep at night if they wake up, though, right? So if that becomes a persistent problem, then it is important to get a sleep consult as well, because you want to make sure that there aren't other outstanding issues like having restless leg, for example, or sleep apnea, especially if your kids are kind of overweight or not sleeping well and you hear snoring, for example. There's also a very strong kind of sleep hygiene approach, right? Just what is your hygiene around sleep? And there's a great cool toolkit on the Autism Speaks website to describe how to improve your kids' sleep hygiene, right? And so the rule of thumb, if you can't fall asleep, is that you get out of bed, right? Because you don't want bed, just like anxiety or being too heart palpitation can be connected to just approaching friends, right? Sleep and your bed can become associated with wakefulness or restlessness or the inability to sleep. So if you can't fall asleep, you're supposed to get up for a little while and then try to go back to sleep, okay? No computer for 2 hours before your kids go to bed is another rule of thumb, okay? So there are a variety of different rules around bedtime, rituals for bedtime, soothing activities that lead up to the 2 hours before you want your kids to go to sleep. Okay. So sleep hygiene is really important because these kids they'll stay on the computer until you're ready to yank it out of their hands, right? So that's an important piece. David, since you're here, do you have any other? Look at that. One of our ARNPs are here, so I can look at him and say, what didn't I say right? All right. Yes.
Since it's summertime now, what's a good way to tell him school's not starting until September, he's not asking me 100 times a day? Like, put a calendar out and say it's in September. I get irritated when it's like 99th time of the day and I'm like, it's not school until September.
Right. I would get a calendar and mark the days off. Do you know?
Just only answer them like once and then just put answering the question?
I would say go check the calendar.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. And then even if he starts, you could say, even after a while, just don't even say anything, just point to the calendar and then just go, do you know? I'm serious, like I would just do it that concretely. You could also write a social story saying school ended whatever day it ended. Now there are there are 2 months until school starts. I'm going to check my calendar to see how much more time there is. Okay, and reward him when he even goes towards the calendar. Okay, make it an incentive to go check the calendar, and he may report back to you, just so you're ready for that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question, but also your idea actually reminded me of like the thing that you give kids like before Christmas, and that is where they take the chocolate out and then it counts.
Oh, an advent calendar.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a good
Like,
idea.
school for that.
Oh, I like that. That's really
That's
concrete.
what I thought of when you were talking.
Yeah, that would also be fun. You could put a lot of.
We have the
That's a great
microphones because there are
idea.
people all across
Yeah.
everywhere else that can't hear what you guys are saying. So if you could talk to the microphone, that would be awesome. Sorry.
And Jim is politely not telling me not to to rephrase what people say, to say it again. So the comment was to use something like an advent calendar to mark the days over the summer break, which I think is a great idea because, you could put little calming tools in there. That would be really cool. I like that. Someone should market that. Yeah. Another question.
Well, my question was because you talk a lot about strategies that you might have for children and adolescent ages, and something that is pretty prevalent in everyone is that as we grow older, we kind of grow into having these habits that accumulate. And so, what are some ways to what would your advice be for strategies for adults to overcome these habits that are formed over time?
So the question is how to change a habit that you have over time. That is a very big question because it takes a lot to change a habit. One is that you have to be motivated to change it, right? So that's probably the first step, is to really figure out what's a person's point of motivation and to remind them, why'd you start this every day? So every time you try to make a different decision about a habit. But you'd really want to break down what is the habit and what's rewarding it, and then to find out find different rewards that compete with that habit.
And what is the best way of communicating this with someone?
So what's the best way?
Communicating this with someone who's nonverbal?
With someone who's nonverbal, using visuals. But it may be tough to, that's a way that you would really want to look at the function and introduce them to an alternative and reward that. That's a good question, though.
One thing I wanted to share was we weren't very successful with the mindfulness, and maybe her therapist wasn't either. And so another strategy that's really helped is she worked with an art therapist who was also a mental health worker, and then the art became the way of getting to mindfulness.
Yes.
And that really was effective with my daughter. And our family rule was art has no rules. So you can't be wrong when you're doing art. So there was no anxiety associated with art.
Oh, that's great.
And
it's
really
true. There are other
huge difference in her life.
That's really important to say, that art is another form. We have a group of girls who also knit, which is really interesting, and do cross stitch, or guys who will do organizational stuff or Legos. It's really interesting what can be a mindful activity. So, and that's actually what's important to know about mindfulness. It's not always about meditation. It's about paying attention to the moment. So, and some things really hook kids to the moment, or people in general. It can be art, it can be doing something with your hands, it can be walking, it can be a variety, it can be eating, right? So it really, for some kids, needs to be hooked to something really concrete. So, you're right, but you found a good mindful activity.
Hard to not give up the one that we thought we were,
Yeah. No, that's terrific, though.
Can we go one here, and then please could you ask the sites if they
Yes, thank you. One more question here, and then we will ask the sites. You moderate who does what. Okay.
Hi. I'm wondering what your suggestions would be to deal with the rare specific phobias. Where to start?
Can you give me an example?
My daughter has a phobia of drains, and I've consulted her mental health therapist, behavioral therapist, and what they have told us pretty much is real general, teach her the function of the drain, show her that things can't go down it, put your hand over it, can't go down it, give her social stories about it. It's not working.
No.
And she's
I
had, now
don't
she's
think it
had a
would.
nightmare about it, and it's gotten 10 times worse.
Yeah, so systematically, what you would want to do is expose her to drains, but at the same time, she needs something to do that's calming or positive. So a good example is you would start off by showing her pictures of drains. If she could touch them, for example, she'd get her favorite treat, right? And then you'd systematically move her into the bathroom, a bathroom that she really likes, and closer to the drain. But it's very systematic. You'd move from like pictures, touching the pictures, to going into a bathroom, to touching the sink, to touching the drain. Does that make sense? It's really, really, it depends on the child. It can be faster than months, but it needs a lot of work at home. That's for parents who have done the kind of systematic desensitization when their kids are really anxious. You may be in the therapist's office for 6 weeks, but at home, I could tell you're doing lots of iterations with this stuff. Okay, you may come and see one of us, but really there's a lot that's happening in the middle. So that's how I would approach it. I wouldn't use the other, because what they're suggesting to you is too cognitive. And she needs real exposure and what we call response prevention, which means she can't go, even though she wants to. It's not for the faint of heart. So, but it is what works. So, anyone at the sites have any questions? Last chance. I'm going to take another question here.
I have a 4.5-year-old who has sensory issues, and his older brother has autism. And our 4.5-year-old is now launching out lots of new behaviors and a lot of anxiety. And one thing is he seems to not be able to spend any time alone. So we try to have a quiet time every afternoon for 45 minutes to an hour. He used to be fine with it. Now he can't. So he comes with every excuse under the sun to not be alone. Calling to go use the bathroom, to do whatever, and pounds on the walls, just everything he can to get out of it. Is that too much to ask for someone of that age, even though he could do it 6 months ago?
Well, did it just start in the last month?
It's been several months now, maybe 3-4 months.
Okay. So
And then nighttime is the exact same thing. It's hell. Trying to get him to bed now is just off the charts bad. He does have some nightmares, not night terrors yet, we don't think, but some nightmares, but just does not want to go to sleep. And it takes us almost an hour to get him down every night now for about 2 months.
That might be. So what I would do is I would try to go for the thing that, so for sleep, for example, what I would do with him is do you need to fall asleep with him?
I haven't done that because I feel like if I start that, then he'll ask it every night. Because I've done it in the past for 5 minutes, and he'll say, "Oh no, Mom, stay longer."
I'm just asking.
Yeah, and we had gone through that. Yeah.
Because you'd want to start to move yourself out of the situation, and actually, that's how you would do it for separation anxiety, because that sounds like what he's struggling with. So, and I don't know what your other son is doing. I don't know environmentally what may have changed, because that would be kind of some of the questions.
Either. Our older son does really well with sleep now.
Yeah. Oh no, I mean why your little one
I
is.
see.
It's also age appropriate for him to have some separation anxiety. But at the same time, you'd want to kind of start to remove yourself really slowly from the situation. Like it's almost like physically steps back.
Yeah, like we sing one song with him at his bed. We talk about the next day, whatever, because each day is a little bit different. What will happen the next day, and then I step back at the door. I sing another song.
That sounds about right.
And then I say, okay, now it's time to go night-night, so please don't call me because you need to go to sleep now. I'll see you tomorrow. I'm the one getting up with you, whatever it may be. And then I leave, and then within 5 minutes, I need to go pee-pee, or I need more song, or I need this, or just screaming. He'll just scream. And he can scream for 2 hours straight. He has that type of stamina.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe he's having trouble with sleep onset. Might be worthwhile to take a look at.
It's just started. Because our older son we thought had sleep apnea. Went through all the sleep testing. Here was a pacifier. It was keeping an obstruction.
Yeah. Wow.
And it runs in our family. That's why we looked into it, and epilepsy and all sorts of other things. So he was fine. We don't think that our younger one has that, but yeah, maybe some developmental that now
I
is
think it
just
might be
starting.
worth it to
Look
do
into
that.
some.
But at the same time, like if you were systematically moving yourself out, there would be a
Yeah.
time when you don't say anything.
Okay.
So there's a time when you're doing that around sleep, there's a time that you're engaged, and then you're still present, but you're not engaged. Does that make
Okay.
sense? So
Yeah.
you're there, but you're not singing a song. You're not, because what you're doing now is like there's this high degree of engagement, and then you're gone.
Right, 'cause he's like, one more song. Oh,
Right.
mama, one more
Right.
thing.
And you
then
would
he
say,
pauses.
and you
'cause
would
he
say,
can't
to,
remember.
and you would say to him, "I'm just going to sit here quietly for a little bit, or I'm going to listen to some of my own music." Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah.
That's how
Yeah.
you fade yourself out. You
Okay.
fade out. You don't just cut the engagement off. You fade the engagement.
Because then he escalates and just screams.
So you try
we're
that
starting
out.
over
But I
again.
think it's
Okay.
worthwhile to also get a behavioral consult.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. One more.
We have a question,
So at the
we have a
beginning,
question
we
from
talked
Federal
about
Way.
using-
Do you have a time
Okay.
for a regional question? Go ahead.
Okay. We'll take your question. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering if you have any general advice for calming for like a 3-4-year-old who's fairly low functioning, just general day-to-day stuff that we can do when he's kind of constantly anxious.
Okay. I would use more sensory-based strategies for him. Do you know, like, if he likes different sensory kinds of things, I would build that into the routine of his day. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. That was one of my easier questions. Thank you. Yes.
So you talked about at the beginning of the talk about using medicine as treatment only after trying behavioral therapy. I'm wondering. I've also heard kind of these other notion that it's useful to kind of reset the neurochemistry
Yeah.
with medication.
Mhm.
Curious if there's differences specifically with anxiety, or
No.
with ASD with anxiety than
No, I wouldn't say that. Let me go back, because I think the way that I think about it is pretty specific. If I feel that most of the time the kids are living here, then I would say that I'm not going to be able to do much intervention. Does that make sense? For me, it's about how accessible is a child to intervention. And if I think that their stress is too high to be able to implement calming strategies, like if they move here really rapidly, then I would say you need to really focus on an SSRI, get a med consult in order to start working, and then we can think about, once you have the strategies on board, coming off of that. Does that make sense? But for a kiddo who's really living here, I would rather try the behavioral strategies first. But you're right that neurochemistry doesn't really necessarily do a reset in children. So it's a little controversial. So, okay, one more question, and then I need to go home.
Thank you very much.
I have a long drive.
What is the effectiveness of hypnotherapy or autosuggestion, that sort of thing?
There's not good evidence for hypnotherapy for this population of kids, but it's also not been studied. But there's not good evidence for hypnotherapy in pediatrics to start with, unless it's for specific medical procedures, for example. So, okay. Alrighty, folks, thank you so much. If you have questions, you can always, I'm a person really easily reached by email. It's the best way to get me. My email is Felice, F-E-L-I, it's my full name, .orlich, @seattlechildrens.org. Alrighty. Thank you so much for coming tonight.